I want to explain what my workshop actually represented to me before describing what happened, because without understanding the scale of what that space meant, both practically and personally, I do not think the full weight of what Rosalind did will land the way it deserves to. I have worked as a custom furniture maker for almost 18 years, starting as a side hobby while I worked a completely unrelated corporate job, gradually building it into a legitimate full-time business over the better part of a decade, to the point where by the time this story takes place, I was running a genuinely successful commissioned furniture operation entirely out of a workshop I had built on my own property specifically for that purpose. That workshop was not some casual hobby garage. It was a proper commercial-grade space, close to 1,400 square feet, climate-controlled, wired for industrial equipment including a substantial table saw, multiple specialized routing and joinery machines, a dedicated finishing room with proper ventilation for staining and sealing work, and at any given time, somewhere between 2 and 6 pieces of client-commissioned furniture in various stages of completion, representing real financial value, real deadlines, and real professional reputation riding on every single piece. I live in a community called Thistlewood Manor, a fairly upscale development of about 80 homes on larger than average lots, part of why I had the physical space to build a proper commercial workshop in the first place. I had been a resident there for 11 years by the time this happened, generally well regarded within the community, current on all dues, involved occasionally in neighborhood events, and with essentially no history of any conflict with the HOA leadership beyond the completely ordinary friction that comes with any community governance structure. Rosalind Ashgrove had been HOA president for a little over 3 years. I did not know her particularly well personally. Our interactions limited mostly to the occasional community meeting or the kind of brief driveway conversation neighbors have without ever really getting to know each other. What I did know, mostly through the general texture of neighborhood conversation that circulates whether you actively seek it out or not, was that Rosalind had developed something of a reputation over her tenure for a particular kind of confident entitlement. The sense, several neighbors had described to me over the years in various ways, that rules and normal social boundaries applied to other people rather than to her, framed always with a certain polished, socially comfortable charm that made pushing back against her feel considerably more awkward than it should have. I had never personally experienced that side of her directly until the day my daughter, Josephine, who was 7 at the time, and I pulled into our driveway after her Tuesday afternoon soccer practice. I noticed something was different about my property before I had even fully parked, because my workshop's large rolling access door, which I distinctly remembered leaving raised for ventilation purposes when I had stepped out that morning, was now lowered nearly all the way, just enough gap remaining at the bottom for someone to duck beneath, clearly positioned deliberately to obscure whatever was inside from casual view of the street. I told Josephine to wait in the car for just a moment, raised that door fully, and stood there for what felt like a genuinely disorienting stretch of time, trying to fully process what I was looking at, because parked directly in the center of my workshop, straddling the exact floor space where I had a client's nearly completed dining table, sitting on temporary support horses that had clearly been shoved aside and knocked over to make room, was a large, obviously brand new, and obviously extremely expensive SUV that I did not recognize. On my table saw's flat work surface, weighted down with what I would later realize was one of my own carving chisels, sat a note, handwritten on what looked like personalized stationery bearing an elegant monogram, which I read standing there in stunned silence while Josephine, curious now, had gotten out of the car and was tugging gently at my sleeve asking what was wrong. The note explained, in a tone I can only describe as breezy and utterly certain of its own reasonableness, that a significant hailstorm had been forecast for that afternoon, that Rosalind had noticed my workshop door open while walking her dog earlier, and had decided, and I am quoting this as closely as I can recall because I photographed the note before doing anything else, that a space clearly built to protect valuable equipment was exactly the kind of secure shelter her new vehicle needed. And that she trusted, as a fellow community member, I would understand and appreciate her initiative in protecting a significant investment from weather damage. I want to walk through my reaction in careful stages, because it moved through several distinct emotional phases very quickly, and each stage matters for understanding exactly why I ultimately made the decision I did. The first stage was simple, almost paralyzing disbelief, the kind where you read something twice because your brain genuinely refuses to accept that a near stranger had let herself into your private commercial workspace, physically moved and knocked over expensive support equipment, holding a client's nearly finished custom furniture piece, and left her vehicle there entirely without permission, all based on nothing more than a door she happened to notice open during a dog walk. The second stage arrived when I actually walked further into the workshop and saw the full extent of what had been disturbed, not just the knocked-over support horses, but a dining table commission I had been working on for close to 3 months for a client with a firm delivery deadline now less than 2 weeks away. A table that had thankfully not been directly struck by the SUV itself, but that now sat at a precarious, uneven angle on partially collapsed supports. Close enough to real damage that my stomach genuinely dropped looking at it. The third stage, the one that ultimately determined everything that followed, arrived once Josephine, standing beside me now looking up at that enormous unfamiliar vehicle filling most of her father's workshop, asked in the completely straightforward way 7-year-olds ask things, why a strange car was in Daddy's shop and whether I was going to be mad about it. I told her honestly that I did not fully know yet what had happened, but that I was absolutely going to figure it out, and something about saying that out loud to my daughter, framing this as a problem I was actively going to solve rather than simply react to emotionally, crystallized a specific plan that had already been forming somewhere in the back of my mind from the moment I first understood what I was looking at. I already had a family vacation scheduled to depart the following morning, a 2-week trip to visit my sister's family across the country, planned and fully paid for since the previous spring, flights booked, everything arranged. I made a decision standing right there in that workshop doorway with my daughter beside me, a decision I have thought about many times since and remain completely at peace with. I did not call Rosalind. I did not text her. I did not leave a note explaining that this was unacceptable and that she needed to move her vehicle immediately before I left for vacation the following morning. Instead, I photographed absolutely everything first, methodically, the note itself, the SUV's exact position relative to the damaged support horses and the tilted dining table, the general disturbed state of my workspace, all of it time-stamped clearly on my phone, because even in that first disoriented moment, some part of me understood clearly that thorough documentation was going to matter enormously no matter what happened next. Then, with Josephine watching from a safe distance near the doorway, genuinely fascinated by what her father was doing rather than upset, I walked to my workshop's control panel and lowered the rolling door completely, engaged the manual security bar that supplements the electric motor specifically for situations involving extended absences, secured the separate personnel entrance door as well, and activated the full security system I had installed 2 years earlier following a genuine rash of tool thefts that had hit a neighboring development, a system including motion-activated cameras, continuous recording with automatic cloud backup, and a loud, audible alarm that would trigger immediately upon any attempted unauthorized entry. Rosalind Ashgrove's Escalade was now completely sealed inside a locked, alarmed, continuously monitored workshop, with absolutely no way for her to retrieve it without either contacting me directly or attempting forced entry that would trigger both an immediate alarm and complete video documentation of whatever she chose to do about it. I did not sleep especially well that night, not out of any guilt, I want to be clear about that, but out of a kind of nervous, almost giddy anticipation about what the following morning would bring once Rosalind presumably discovered what had happened. My wife, Carmelita, when I explained the full situation to her that evening after Josephine had gone to bed, found the entire thing almost as absurd and satisfying as I did, though she did express one practical concern that I want to address directly, since I know some people hearing this story might wonder the same thing. She asked whether locking someone's vehicle inside my property while I left the country for 2 weeks might create some kind of legal problem for me rather than for Rosalind. I called my attorney that same evening specifically to address that exact question before committing fully to the plan, and her answer settled any remaining hesitation completely. She confirmed that Rosalind had, through her own voluntary and entirely unauthorized actions, committed a clear trespass by entering my private commercial property and depositing her vehicle there without any permission whatsoever, and that I had no legal obligation whatsoever to disrupt my own family vacation, planned and paid for months in advance, to accommodate a situation Rosalind alone had created. If anything, my attorney noted, continuing exactly as planned with my scheduled travel, while ensuring I had thorough photographic and video documentation of the entire situation, would put me in an exceptionally strong position if Rosalind attempted any kind of retaliatory claim, since any reasonable examination of the timeline and evidence would make immediately clear who had actually created this entire situation through their own unauthorized actions. We left for the airport at 6 the following morning, Josephine excited about the trip and completely unbothered by the strange car situation from the day before, treating it, in the wonderfully uncomplicated way children often process adult conflicts, as simply an interesting story to tell her cousins once we arrived. I turned my phone to airplane mode somewhere over the middle of the country, roughly 3 hours into our first flight, deliberately, and did not turn it back on until we landed at our connecting airport roughly 5 hours later. When I did turn it back on, standing in a crowded terminal with Carmelita already herding Josephine toward our connecting gate, I watched 37 notifications load in rapid succession, missed calls and text messages, the overwhelming majority from a number I did not immediately recognize, but would quickly understand belonged to Rosalind Ashgrove herself. I want to walk through the general arc of that message trail, because it evolved dramatically over the course of that single day back home, while I had been completely unreachable in the air. The earliest messages, time-stamped for what would have been mid-morning back at Thistlewood Manor, carried a tone of mild, almost amused irritation, asking me to please move my car, as though I had somehow been the one to inconvenience her rather than the reverse, a framing so completely inverted from reality that reading it standing in that airport terminal, I genuinely laughed out loud, drawing a curious glance from Carmelita. By early afternoon back home, the tone had shifted considerably, messages now explicitly demanding that I return immediately to release her vehicle, mentioning that she had an important community event that evening requiring her presence and her car, and suggesting, with what read as genuine indignation, that my continued unavailability represented a serious lapse in what she called basic neighborly courtesy. By evening back home, the final several messages had abandoned any remaining pretense of polite request entirely, threatening formal HOA violations against me for what she characterized as deliberately hostile and unreasonable behavior. And in the very last voicemail I eventually listened to that evening from our hotel room, threatening explicitly to contact local police and report her vehicle as stolen if I did not immediately return to release it. I sat on the edge of that hotel bed for a long moment after finishing that final voicemail, and then, much like the airport terminal earlier that day, I found myself laughing again, genuinely and for a considerable stretch of time, because the sheer audacity of Rosalind Ashgrove threatening to report her own vehicle as stolen, when that vehicle sat exactly where she had voluntarily and without any authorization whatsoever driven it herself. Inside a private commercial workshop she had entered without permission of any kind, struck me as one of the most remarkable examples of inverted entitlement I had ever personally witnessed. Carmelita, watching my reaction from across the room, asked what exactly I found so funny, and when I explained the stolen vehicle threat, she laughed nearly as hard as I did, though she also, practically as always, suggested I call our attorney again just to be certain we understood exactly how to handle things if Rosalind actually followed through on that threat. I called my attorney again that same evening, walking her through the escalating message trail and specifically the stolen vehicle threat. She confirmed, once again, that this created essentially no exposure for me whatsoever, explaining that any competent law enforcement response to a reported stolen vehicle would begin with establishing the actual circumstances of how that vehicle came to be wherever it currently was, and that my security footage, showing Rosalind voluntarily driving her own vehicle into my private workshop, parking it, leaving a note, and departing entirely on her own before I ever engaged the security system at all, would make immediately clear to any responding officer that no theft had occurred in any legal sense whatsoever. If anything, my attorney pointed out, a police report specifically documenting the full timeline would likely work considerably in my favor if I ever needed to pursue any kind of formal complaint against Rosalind for the original trespass and the damage to my client's furniture commission. I sent Rosalind exactly one response that entire evening, carefully worded after a lengthy conversation with my attorney about precisely how to phrase it. I told her that I had never given her permission to enter my private workshop, move my equipment, damage furniture belonging to a paying client, or leave her vehicle there under any circumstances, that I was currently out of the country on a family vacation planned and paid for months in advance, that her vehicle remained completely secure and undamaged inside a locked, alarmed, and continuously monitored workshop, and that I would be entirely willing to discuss reasonable arrangements for its retrieval upon my return in 2 weeks, and not before. I did not receive an immediate response to that message, which I found almost more satisfying than any reply could have been, imagining, correctly as it would turn out, that Rosalind was sitting somewhere back at Thistlewood Manor, genuinely struggling to process that her usual approach of escalating demands and vague threats had simply failed to produce the immediate capitulation she had clearly expected. I turned my phone back to airplane mode for the remainder of that evening, and for most of the following 2 weeks beyond checking in briefly each morning, specifically to monitor whether anything genuinely urgent had developed, a practice that turned out to be considerably more eventful than I had anticipated. Because what happened at Thistlewood Manor over the following days, while I remained completely unreachable and enjoying my family vacation, turned into something considerably more consequential than a simple parking dispute. I'm going to stop the story here. At the moment I turned that phone back to airplane mode in our hotel room with Carmelita already asleep beside me and Josephine dreaming, I imagine, about the beach we were scheduled to visit the following day, because everything that happened over the following 2 weeks back home, what Rosalind actually attempted once threats alone, proved completely ineffective. The involvement of an actual responding police officer who came to investigate her stolen vehicle report in person, and what that officer discovered once he reviewed my security footage and understood the complete sequence of events, changed this from an absurd but ultimately containable parking dispute into something that would end Rosalind Ashgrove's HOA presidency the moment I finally walked back through my own front door. Part 2 picks up with those 2 weeks back at Thistlewood Manor, while I remained entirely unreachable on a beach thousands of miles away. The police visit her own stolen vehicle report triggered, and the moment I finally returned home and gave Rosalind Ashgrove exactly 1 hour to remove her Escalade from my property for good, along with considerably more consequences than she had ever imagined a hailstorm excuse could bring down on her. Thumbnail text. Her SUV sat locked up for 2 full weeks. Content.